Well, because it's summer, I know that many of you have been on a journey or are planning a journey, or you can relate to those who have made a journey recently. And it's a worthy conversation to start up. During the summer, you can almost begin conversations with what journey have you been on, or are you planning to be a part of? Are you going to the beach, going to the mountains? Is there a family visit that you're going to be making this summer? We go on these trips to go somewhere, you notice, but we don't go to get necessarily to a certain place, but we always tend to say we are getting away from it all. A couple of weeks ago, my family and I were getting away from it all, getting away from some of the routine and some of the things that we often do, the daily grind, to get away from it all. That's the beauty of a time of vacation, a time of renewal, the opportunity to relax and to do nothing, if given the opportunity to do such a thing. I've taken my own survey, and it reveals the results I'll let you in on. I've been wondering about how people spend their vacation, and it is difficult for them to do nothing. That's what my survey shows. Doing nothing seems like a hard thing to do, even on vacation. We don't follow through with that. We often need vacation from our vacation. Have you ever had that experience? You can relate. Well, in our reading today, Jesus is on a journey, but he's on no vacation. Many of our summertime journeys take us from the city toward the country. Jesus is heading toward the city, away from the country. He's on a journey to Jerusalem, and you know what that means if you've been reading the Gospel of Luke up until this point of chapter 10 and 9, just prior to it. That traveling that he is about is to Jerusalem, and it means that he is on his way to the cross. He has, in Luke's words, set his face toward Jerusalem in the closing of chapter 9. And on his way to Jerusalem, a question is put to Jesus by a lawyer that leads Jesus to tell a story about a man who was traveling from Jerusalem. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He tells a story about a man traveling from Jerusalem, and there might be something to that. Who is willing to go to Jerusalem, after all? Who is willing to go to the cross? Listen with me to the Gospel of Luke as we encounter chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," the lawyer said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" The lawyer answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, the lawyer asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend.' Which of these 3, do you think, was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" Jesus said. "The one who showed mercy," said the lawyer. Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." Thanks be to God for this reading of the gospel of Jesus Christ. "Teacher," says the lawyer, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" The man who's an expert in the religious law, knows all the Mosaic teachings, a professional interpreter of the Bible, addresses Jesus as teacher. That's what teachers are for, to pose them with questions, right? We pose questions to teachers. We ask for some instruction, some clarification about matters that we're questioning and thinking about. And so it's appropriate that the lawyer is doing that with Jesus that day. You've heard the old saying, those who can do and those who can't teach, which is not fair. It's not a good saying. You should probably not repeat such a saying. Where would we be without the thoughtful, reflective help of teachers? So the lawyer comes to Jesus and poses a question to him. I like this quote from Pelikan. Yaroslav Pelikan said, "The church is always more than a school, but the church cannot be less than a school." I think that's why we gather on a regular basis in this facility, is to be a part of not schooling, but a church that in part, its component is to be a school. We want that from our churches. Churches could be described as a place in which we get away from it all. Certainly that's sometimes what worship can be for us, but it also should be a place where we come and sit at the feet of a teacher. Here our teacher is the Gospel of Luke. Jesus, the teacher, is offering some guidance to us. You see, this lawyer is doing what we do here on a Sunday morning and whenever we gather in this place. Sit at the feet of Jesus, put questions to him, get schooled by him regarding questions of religious matters like, why do bad things happen to good people? Who's my neighbor? Who is and who isn't a part of the fellowship? Do we really believe people change? Such questions as these, and a question like we encounter here, what do we need to do to have eternal life? Jesus, you will note in his response to the lawyer, moves from the lawyer's ideas about things to action. From talking about eternal life someday to go, do, now, today. Jesus seems almost annoyed by the mere mention of ideas and concepts about an eternal life kind of question. Like it's not even a question worth necessarily centering on. He wants to move towards the go and do. He refuses to play the lawyer's game, to keep matters removed from the here and now, eternal life. Let's talk about that. The lawyer wants to test him with that. We in the church get caught up in that sometimes. Sometimes we focus on beliefs that we forget about action. In effect, Jesus' response by telling the story that he does to the lawyer is a story about follow-through, the story that we have come to call the Good Samaritan. Today we're familiar with this story as it's titled the Good Samaritan, but you realize in the time of Jesus there was no such adjective used with Samaritans. For most people hearing this story for the first time, you don't say anything about a good Samaritan. Samaritans weren't considered good. Today we're familiar though with the title Good Samaritan. We give out Good Samaritan awards. We name homes and hospitals and nursing places, nursing homes after Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan Counseling Center was a place that I was familiar with in my time. And then there's this RV group, the Good Sam Club. You know, got a little guy with a halo over it. That's our image of who the Good Samaritan is. Do we really know this story? Does this really fit the image of what Jesus was trying to use this story to teach about? Is the focus on really the Good Samaritan exactly, or is it somewhere else that we should center this story? One way to encounter the Bible that has been helpful for me over the years is to enter it, to choose a character in the story and kind of look at the story from how the character receives the actions of the story. It can change how you think about it. So perhaps we can enter the story and think about it from the Good Samaritan's point of view, but what if we take a different character and focus our attention on the story by looking at that character's experience in the story. Some believe folks in Jesus' day would have identified with the man left half dead on the side of the road in the ditch. The early followers of Jesus were an oppressed lot. They were poor, they were lost, they were forsaken. So the early audience that Jesus would have shared such a story, they would have been connecting with the man left half dead by the side of the road. The people in Jesus' day were occupied by a foreign government. Roman soldiers clanked their way through the streets of Jerusalem. A Roman governor had turned the Jewish king into a puppet ruler of sorts. There was skirmishes in the streets because some wanted the foreign armies out of their country. Theirs were unneighborly times, you might say. Yes, to Jesus' audience and to Luke's audience too, they would have identified with the victim as their neighbor. Who will deliver their neighbor? The victim. Well, a traveling Samaritan comes down the road, and the Jewish victim must accept deliverance from the hand of an enemy. The story assumes the hearer knows the bitter tension between Jews, Judeans, and Samaritans. You've probably heard a preacher go on about Samaritans and Judeans and how they were rival tribes of some sort. But Samaritans were descendants of a mixed population occupying the land north of Jerusalem, the area of Judea. The days of Ezra and Nehemiah, the Samaritans opposed rebuilding Jerusalem. So that was a rub for anybody who lived near Jerusalem. The Samaritans weren't in on rebuilding the temple years and hundreds of years ago. They even had the nerve to build their own place of worship outside of Jerusalem. So there's another point of contention. Can you imagine how the parable would have been disturbing to Jesus' audience if they're focusing on the victim and who's going to help? Not only does deliverance come and is provided by the enemy, it's generously provided by a Samaritan. The wounds are treated and bound. The man is carried on the Samaritan's own animal and taken to the inn. The Samaritan pays for the man's stay, promises additional funding if necessary. The Samaritan is an example of grace in action, and that would not be something they would have considered as an audience to this story. The story reveals that the Samaritan knew about God's grace. Unlike all the other good Bible-quoting people in the story, the priest and the Levite, the Samaritan was someone who knew how to put love into action. The Samaritan was someone who, rather than stepping back and engaging in a discussion of neighbors and needs and welfare reform and whether they should be traveling with children across the border, they instead see a Samaritan who acted, took a risk, became a neighbor to someone in need. There's one word that occurs in this storytelling of Luke that occurs to me as the most central word of the story. It's not a very long word in the English translation, but it is a simple two-letter word. Are you ready for it? Here's how you boil down this story into one word, and it's this word, do. That is the most central part of the story when I get to thinking about the whole storytelling of Luke in this passage. The word do is one of the most important words to consider. This whole thing begins with a man asking, what do I need to do to have eternal life? It's a pretty central question to the understanding of salvation, even in the church today, for us church-going types. What must I do to be related to God with all my heart and soul and strength and might? What must I do to be with God in life and in death for all eternity? Most of the time when we're looking for an answer to that question, someone will be thinking or will say, well, you must believe in Jesus as the Christ. But Jesus says nothing here about that as a way to inherit eternal life. A little follow-through might be a good way to look at what Jesus asks of those people. Do this. Be the one who reaches out to the needs of all. See the stranger, the enemy, see the child of God in everyone, act as a neighbor to them. Do this, says Jesus. The Greek word for do is a little bit bigger word in Greek. It's poio. Poio. Preacher and teacher Will Willimon shares that word is related to our word poem. A poem is not first something with beautiful words. A poem is first something that has been fashioned, made by human creativity. A poem is something beautiful that's done. It's made with words. What do I have to do in order to inherit eternal life? What do I have to do to be with God for this life and in the life to come? Willimon suggests you must go and poio. You must become a poem. Must fashion your life in such a way that the way you live and all that you do becomes a poem, a hymn of praise to God. Go and do. The early church certainly experienced unneighborly times, but it wasn't the only unneighborly time. We certainly know our share of unneighborliness even today. We live in just as much a tribe-oriented time as they did in Jesus' day. We're divided by politics. We create our own political tribes. We have theological tribes. We have generational tribes, baby boomers and Gen Xers and millennials. We're in our own tribes. We even divide ourselves up by who we support. Are you a Hawkeye or a Cyclone? Are you a Panther or a Bulldog? So you're always trying to figure out how you divide yourself on your loyalties and who you even cheer for. We divide ourselves to the point of neighbors becoming rivals. And we divide by borders, of course. We watch in our movies and TV shows that during unneighborly times, the response of choice is violence. A knee-jerk reaction is to get a gun if you're dealing with someone in a different divide from yourself. I don't want to suggest that we have nothing to fear, but our gospel story from the teacher Jesus in the Gospel of Luke guides us otherwise. In unneighborly times, we in the church are to teach neighborliness. Be vigilant in showing the neighbor love. The knee-jerk reaction for the follower of Christ, for the Christian, is to act with care and empathy, compassion and concern. Friends, here's the thing. If the gospel isn't good news for everybody, then it's not good news for anybody. Rob Bell suggests that the church is closely following Jesus when the church gives itself away in radical acts of service and compassion, expecting nothing in return. That's the way of Jesus. That's the way he portrays in the story we encounter today. To do this, the church must stop thinking about everybody primarily in categories of in or out, saved or not, believer or non-believer, but instead to focus on the work that Jesus teaches here, to treat others in ways of love and compassion. It's what we talk about here in our congregation as love first. To be about that love first is the way that we strive to encounter folks. Jesus commanded us to love our neighbor, and our neighbor can be anybody. We are all created in the image of God. We are all sacred, valuable creations of God. Everybody matters. To treat people differently based on their race, their ethnicity, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, to treat a person differently based on their belief or their creed or their politics is to fail to respect the image of God in everyone. As the book of James says, God shows no favoritism. So we don't either. Love first. In today's gospel, Jesus teaches us to be neighborly, calls us to go and do. Jesus has called the question. Now there's nothing for us but to go and do likewise. So be it, and may it be so.